This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, chapters 41 and 42. Chapter 41. To the very last moment, till the full day came upon them with a spring, the fires on the west bank blazed bright and clear, and then Brown saw in a knot of coloured figures motionless between the advanced houses a man in European clothes, in a helmet, all white. "That's him! Look! Look!" Cornelius said excitedly. All Brown's men had sprung up and crowded at his back with lustreless eyes. The group of vivid colours and dark faces with the white figure in their midst were observing the knoll. Brown could see naked arms being raised to shade the eyes, and other brown arms pointing. What should he do? He looked around, and the forest that faced him on all sides walled the cockpit of an unequal contest. He looked once more at his men. A contempt, a weariness, the desire of life, the wish to try for one more chance, for some other grave, struggled in his breast. From the outline the figure presented, it seemed to him that the white man there, backed up by all the power of the land, was examining his position through binoculars. Brown jumped up on the log, throwing his arms up, the palms outward. The coloured group closed round the white man, and fell back twice before he got clear of them, walking slowly alone. Brown remained standing on the log till Jim, appearing and disappearing between the patches of thorny scrub, had nearly reached the creek. Then Brown jumped off and went down to meet him on his side. They met, I should think, not very far from the place, perhaps on the very spot, where Jim took the second desperate leap of his life, the leap that landed him into the life of Patusan, into the trust, the love, the confidence of the people. They faced each other across the creek, and with steady eyes tried to understand each other before they opened their lips. Their antagonism must have been expressed in their glances. I know that Brown hated Jim at first sight. Whatever hopes he might have had vanished at once. This was not the man he had expected to see. He hated him for this, and in a checked flannel shirt with sleeves cut off at the elbows, grey bearded, with a sunken, sun blackened face, he cursed in his heart the other's youth and assurance, his clear eyes and his untroubled bearing. That fellow had got in a long way before him. He did not look like a man who would be willing to give anything for assistance. He had all the advantages on his side possession, security, power. He was on the side of an overwhelming force. He was not hungry and desperate, and he did not seem in the least afraid. And there was something in the very neatness of Jim's clothes, from the white helmet to the canvas leggings and the pipe-clayed shoes, which in Brown's sombre, irritated eyes seemed to belong to things he had in the very shaping of his life condemned and flouted. "Who are you?" asked Jim at last, speaking in his usual voice. "My name's Brown," answered the other loudly. "Captain Brown. What's yours?" And Jim, after a little pause, went on quietly, as if he had not heard. "What made you come here?" "You want to know?" said Brown bitterly. "It's easy to tell. Hunger. And what made you?" "The fellow started at this," said Brown, relating to me the opening of this strange conversation between those two men, separated only by the muddy bed of a creek, but standing on the opposite poles of that conception of life which includes all mankind. "The fellow started at this, and got very red in the face. Too big to be questioned, I suppose. I told him that if he looked upon me as a dead man with whom you may take liberties, he himself was not a whit better off, really. I had a fellow up there who had a bead drawn on him all the time, and only waited for a sign from me. There was nothing to be shocked at this. He had come down of his own free will.
Let us agree, said I, that we are both dead men, and let us talk on that basis as equals. We are all equals before death, I said. I admitted I was there like a rat in a trap, but we had been driven to it, and even a trapped rat can give a bite. He caught me up in a moment. Not if you don't go near the trap till the rat is dead. I told him that sort of game was good enough for these native friends of his, but I would have thought him too white to serve even a rat so. Yes, I had wanted to talk with him, not to beg for my life, though. My fellows were, well, what they were, men like himself, anyhow. All we wanted from him was to come on in the devil's name and have it out. God damn it, said I, while he stood there as still as a wooden post. You don't want to come out here every day with your glasses to count how many of us are left on our feet. Come, either bring your infernal crowd along, or let us go out and starve in the open sea, by God. You have been white once, for all your talk of this being your own people and you being one with them. Are you? And what the devil do you get for it? What is it you've found here that's so damn precious, eh? You don't want us to come down here, perhaps, do you? You are 200 to 1. You don't want us to come down into the open. Ah, I promise you we shall give you some sport before you've done. You talk about me making a cowardly set upon an unoffending people. What's that to me that they are unoffending, when I am starving for next to no offence? But I am not a coward. Don't you be one. Bring them along, or by all the fiends we shall yet manage to send half your unoffending town to heaven with us in smoke.
He was terrible, relating this to me, this tortured skeleton of a man drawn up together with his face over his knees upon a miserable bed in that wretched hovel, and lifting his head to look at me with malignant triumph.
That's what I told him. I knew what to say.
He began again, feebly at first, but working himself up with incredible speed into a fiery utterance of his scorn.
We aren't going into the forest to wander like a string of living skeletons, dropping one after another for ants to go to work upon us before we are fairly dead. Oh no. You don't deserve a better fate, he said. And what do you deserve? I shouted at him. You that I find skulking here with your mouth full of your responsibility, of innocent lives, of your infernal duty. What do you know more of me than I know of you? I came here for food, do you hear? Food to fill our bellies. And what did you come for? What did you ask for when you came here? We don't ask you for anything but to give us a fight or a clear road to go back whence we came. I would fight with you now, says he, pulling at his little moustache. And I would let you shoot me and welcome, I said. This is as good a jumping off place for me as another. I am sick of my infernal luck. But it would be too easy. There are my men in the same boat, and by God I am not the sort to jump out of trouble and leave them in a damned lurch, I said. He stood thinking for a while, and then wanted to know what I had done. Out there, he says, tossing his head downstream, to be hazed about so. Have we met to tell each other the story of our lives? I asked him. Suppose you begin. No? Well, I'm sure I don't want to hear. Keep it to yourself. I know it is no better than mine. I've lived, and so did you, though you talk as if you were one of those people that should have wings so as to go about without touching the dirty earth. Well, it is dirty. I haven't got any wings. I am here because I was afraid once in my life. Want to know of what? Of a prison. That scares me, and you may know it. If it's any good to you, I won't ask you what scared you into this infernal hole, where you seem to have found pretty pickings. That's your luck, and this is mine. The privilege to beg for the favour of being shot quickly, or else kicked out to go free and starve in my own way.
His debilitated body shook with an exultation so vehement, so assured, and so malicious, that it seemed to have driven off the death waiting for him in that hut. The corpse of his mad self-love uprose from rags and destitution as from the dark horrors of a tomb. It is impossible to say how much he lied to Jim then, how much he lied to me now, and to himself always. Vanity plays lurid tricks with our memory, and the truth of every passion wants some pretence to make it live. Standing at the gate of the other world in the guise of a beggar, he had slapped this world's face, he had spat on it, he had thrown upon it an immensity of scorn and revolt at the bottom of his misdeeds. He had overcome them all, men, women, savages, traitors, ruffians, missionaries, and Jim, that beefy-faced beggar. I did not begrudge him this triumph in articulo mortis, this almost posthumous illusion of having trampled all the earth under his feet. While he was boasting to me in his sordid and repulsive agony, I couldn't help thinking of the chuckling talk relating to the time of his greatest splendour, when, during a year or more, Gentleman Brown's ship was to be seen, for many days on end, hovering off an islet befringed with green upon azure, with the dark dot of the mission house on a white beach, while Gentleman Brown, ashore, was casting his spells over a romantic girl for whom Melanesia had been too much, and giving hopes of a remarkable conversion to her husband. The poor man some time or other had been heard to express the intention of winning Captain Brown to a better way of life. Bag Gentleman Brown for glory, as a leery-eyed loafer expressed it once, just to let them see up above what a Western Pacific trading skipper looks like. And this was the man, too, who had run off with a dying woman and had shed tears over her body. Carried on like a big baby, his then mate was never tired of telling. And where the fun came in, I may be kicked to death by diseased Kanakas if I know. Why, gents, she was too far gone when he brought her aboard to know him. She just lay there on her back in his bunk staring at the beam with awful shining eyes, and then she died. Damn bad sort of fever, I guess. I remembered all these stories while, wiping his matted lump of a beard with a livid hand, he was telling me from his noisome couch how he got round, got in, got home on that confounded, immaculate, don't you touch me sort of fellow. He admitted that he couldn't be scared, but there was a way, as broad as a turnpike, to get in and shake his twopenny soul around and inside out and upside down, by God. CHAPTER 42 I don't think he could do more than perhaps look upon that straight path. He seemed to have been puzzled by what he saw, for he interrupted himself in his narrative more than once to exclaim,
"He nearly slipped from me there. I could not make him out. Who was he?"
And after glaring at me wildly, he would go on, jubilating and sneering. To me the conversation of these two across the creek appears now as the deadliest kind of duel on which Fate looked on with her cold-eyed knowledge of the end. No, he didn't turn Jim's soul inside out, but I am much mistaken if the spirit so utterly out of his reach had not been made to taste to the full bitterness of that contest. These were the emissaries with whom the world he had renounced was pursuing him in his retreat. White men from out there, where he did not think himself good enough to live. This was all that came to him, a menace, a shock, a danger to his work. I suppose it is this sad, half resentful, half resigned feeling, piercing through the few words Jim said now and then, that puzzled Brown so much in the reading of his character. Some great men owe most of their greatness to the ability of detecting in those they destine for their tools the exact quality of strength that matters for their work; and Brown, as though he had been really great, had a satanic gift of finding out the best and the weakest spot in his victims. He admitted to me that Jim wasn't of the sort that can be got over by truckling, and accordingly he took care to show himself as a man confronting without dismay ill luck, censure, and disaster. The smuggling of a few guns was no great crime, he pointed out. As to coming to Patusan, who had the right to say he hadn't come to beg? The infernal people here let loose at him from both banks without staying to ask questions. He made the point brazenly, for in truth Dain Waris's energetic action had prevented the greatest calamities, because Brown told me distinctly that, perceiving the size of the place, he had resolved instantly in his mind that as soon as he had gained a footing he would set fire right and left, and begin by shooting down everything living in sight, in order to cow and terrify the population. The disproportion of forces was so great that this was the only way of giving him the slightest chance of attaining his ends, he argued in a fit of coughing. But he didn't tell Jim this. As to the hardships and starvation they had gone through, these had been very real. It was enough to look at his band. He made, at the sound of a shrill whistle, all his men appear standing in a row on the logs in full view, so that Jim could see them. For the killing of the man it had been done. Well, it had. But was this not war, bloody war, in a corner? And the fellow had been killed cleanly, shot through the chest, not like that poor devil of his lying now in the creek. They had to listen to him dying for 6 hours with his entrails torn with slugs. At any rate, this was a life for a life. And all this was said with the weariness, with the recklessness of a man spurred on and on by ill luck till he cares not where he runs. When he asked Jim with a sort of brusque despairing frankness whether he himself, straight now, didn't understand that when
it came to saving one's life in the dark, one didn't care who else went. 3, 30, 300 people.
It was as if a demon had been whispering advice in his ear.
I made him wince, boasted Brown to me. He very soon left off coming the righteous over me. He just stood there with nothing to say, and looking as black as thunder, not at me, on the ground.
He asked Jim whether he had nothing fishy in his life to remember that he was so damnably hard upon a man trying to get out of a deadly hole by the first means that came to hand, and so on, and so on. And there ran through the rough talk a vein of subtle reference to their common blood, an assumption of common experience, a sickening suggestion of common guilt, of secret knowledge, that was like a bond of their minds and of their hearts. At last Brown threw himself down full length and watched Jim out of the corners of his eyes. Jim, on his side of the creek, stood thinking and switching his leg. The houses in view were silent, as if a pestilence had swept them clean of every breath of life, but many invisible eyes were turned from within upon the two men with the creek between them, a stranded white boat, and the body of the third man half sunk in the mud. On the river canoes were moving again, for Patusan was recovering its belief in the stability of earthly institutions since the return of the White Lord. The right bank, the platforms of the houses, the rafts moored along the shores, even the roofs of bathing huts were covered with people that, far away out of earshot and almost out of sight, were straining their eyes towards the knoll beyond the Rajah's stockade. Within the wide irregular ring of forests, broken in two places by the sheen of the river, there was a silence. "Will you promise to leave the coast?" Jim asked. Brown lifted and let fall his hand, giving everything up as it were, accepting the inevitable. "And surrender your arms?" Jim went on. Brown sat up and glared across.
Surrender our arms? Not till you come to take them out of our stiff hands. You think I am gone crazy with funk? Oh no! That and the rags I stand in is all I've got in the world, besides a few more breech-loaders on board, and I expect to sell the lot in Madagascar, if I ever get so far, begging my way from ship to ship."
Jim said nothing to this. At last, throwing away the switch he held in his hand, he said, as if speaking to himself, "I don't know whether I have the power."
"You don't know? And you wanted me just now to give up my arms? That's good too, cried Brown. And suppose they say one thing to you and do the other thing to me?
He calmed down markedly.
I dare say you have the power. What's the meaning of all this talk? He continued. What did you come down here for? To pass the time of day?
Very well, said Jim, lifting his head suddenly after a long silence. You shall have a clear road, or else a clear fight. He turned on his heel and walked away. Brown got up at once, but he did not go up the hill till he had seen Jim disappear between the first houses. He never set his eyes on him again. On his way back he met Cornelius, slouching down with his head between his shoulders. He stopped before Brown. "Why didn't you kill him?" he demanded in a sour, discontented voice.
Because I could do better than that,
Brown said with an amused smile.
Never, never,
protested Cornelius with energy.
Couldn't. I have lived here for many years.
Brown looked up at him curiously. There were many sides to the life of that place in arms against him, things he would never find out. Cornelius slunk past dejectedly in the direction of the river. He was now leaving his new friends. He accepted the disappointing course of events with a sulky obstinacy, which seemed to draw more together his little yellow old face, and as he went down he glanced askant here and there, never giving up his fixed idea. Henceforth events moved fast, without a check, flowing from the very hearts of men like a stream from a dark source, and we see Jim amongst them, mostly through Tamb' Itam's eyes. The girl's eyes had watched him too, but her life is too much entwined with his. There is her passion, her wonder, her anger, and above all her fear and her unforgiving love. Of the faithful servant, uncomprehending as the rest of them, it is the fidelity alone that comes into play, a fidelity and a belief in his Lord so strong that even amazement is subdued to a sort of saddened acceptance of a mysterious failure. He has eyes only for one figure, and through all the mazes of bewilderment he preserves his air of guardianship, of obedience, of care. His master came back from his talk with the white men, walking slowly towards the stockade in the street. Everyone was rejoiced to see him return, for while he was away every man had been afraid not only of him being killed, but also of what would come after. Jim went into one of the houses where old Doramin had retired, and remained alone for a long time with the head of the Bugis settlers. No doubt he discussed the only course to follow with him then, but no man was present at the conversation. Only Tamb' Itam, keeping as close to the door as he could, heard his master say, "Yes, I shall let all the people know that such is my wish, but I spoke to you, O Doramin, before all the others, and alone, for you know my heart as well as I know yours, and its greatest desire, and you know well also that I have no thought but for the people's good." Then his master, lifting the sheeting in the doorway, went out, and he, Tamb' Itam, had a glimpse of old Doramin within, sitting in the chair with his hands on his knees, and looking between his feet. Afterwards he followed his master to the fort, where all the principal Bugis and Patusan inhabitants had been summoned for a talk. Tamb' Itam himself hoped that there would be some fighting. "What was it but the taking of another hill?" he exclaimed regretfully. However, in the town many hoped that the rapacious strangers would be induced by the sight of so many brave men making ready to fight to go away. It would be a good thing if they went away. Since Jim's arrival had been made known before daylight by the gun fired from the fort and the beating of the big drum there, the fear that had hung over Patusan had broken and subsided like a wave on a rock, leaving the seething foam of excitement, curiosity, and endless speculation. Half of the population had been ousted out of their homes for purposes of defence, and were living in the street on the left side of the river, crowding round the fort, and in momentary expectation of seeing their abandoned dwellings on the threatened bank burst into flames. The general anxiety was to see the matter settled quickly. Food, through Jules's care, had been served out to the refugees. Nobody knew what their white man would do. Some remarked that it was worse than in Sherif Ali's war. Then many people did not care. Now everybody had something to lose. The movements of canoes passing to and fro between the two parts of the town were watched with interest. A couple of Bugis war boats lay anchored in the middle of the stream to protect the river, and a thread of smoke stood at the bow of each. The men in them were cooking their midday rice when Jim, after his interviews with Brown and Doramin, crossed the river and entered by the water gate of his fort. The people inside crowded round him so that he could hardly make his way to the house. They had not seen him before, because on his arrival during the night he had only exchanged a few words with the girl, who had come down to the landing stage for the purpose, and had gone on at once to join the chiefs and the fighting men on the other bank. People shouted greetings after him. One old woman raised a laugh by pushing her way to the front madly and enjoining him in a scolding voice to see to it that her two sons, who were with Doramin, did not come to harm at the hands of the robbers. Several of the bystanders tried to pull her away, but she struggled and cried, "Let me go! What is this, O Muslims? This laughter is unseemly. Are they not cruel, bloodthirsty robbers bent on killing?" "Let her be," said Jim, and as a silence fell suddenly he said slowly, "Everybody shall be safe." He entered the house before the great sigh and the loud murmurs of satisfaction had died out. There's no doubt his mind was made up that Brown should have his way clear back to the sea. His fate, revolted, was forcing his hand. He had for the first time to affirm his will in the face of outspoken opposition. "There was much talk, and at first my master was silent," Tamb' Itam said. "Darkness came, and then I lit the candles on the long table. The chiefs sat on each side, and the lady remained by my master's right hand." When he began to speak, the unaccustomed difficulty seemed only to fix his resolve more immovably. The white men were now waiting for his answer on the hill. Their chief had spoken to him in the language of his own people, making clear many things difficult to explain in any other speech. They were erring men whom suffering had made blind to right and wrong. It is true that lives had been lost already, but why lose more? He declared to his hearers, the assembled heads of the people, that their welfare was his welfare, their losses his losses, their mourning his mourning. He looked round at the grave listening faces and told them to remember that they had fought and worked side by side. They knew his courage here a murmur interrupted him and that he had never deceived them. For many years they had dwelt together. He loved the land and the people living in it with a very great love. He was ready to answer with his life for any harm that should come to them if the white men with beards were allowed to retire. They were evil doers, but their destiny had been evil too. Had he ever advised them ill? Had his words ever brought suffering to the people? He asked. He believed that it would be best to let these whites and their followers go with their lives. It would be a small gift. "I, whom you have tried and found always true, ask you to let them go." He turned to Doramin. The old nakhoda made no movement. "Then," said Jim, "call in Dain Waris, your son, my friend, for in this business I shall not lead." End of chapters 41 and 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 43 and 44. Chapter 43 Tamb' Itam, behind his chair, was thunderstruck. The declaration produced an immediate sensation. "Let them go, because this is best in my knowledge, which has never deceived you," Jim insisted. There was a silence. In the darkness of the courtyard could be heard the subdued, whispering, shuffling noise of many people. Doramin raised his heavy head and said there was no more reading of hearts than touching the sky with the hand. But he consented. The others gave their opinion in turn. "It is best. Let them go," and so on, but most of them simply said that they believed Tuan Jim. In this simple form of assent to his will lies the whole gist of the situation. Their creed his truth, and the testimony to that faithfulness which made him in his own eyes the equal of the impeccable men who never fall out of the ranks. Stein's words, "romantic, romantic," seemed to ring over those distances that will never give him up now to a world indifferent to his failings and his virtues, and to that ardent and clinging affection that refuses him the dole of tears in the bewilderment of a great grief and of eternal separation. From the moment the sheer truthfulness of his last 3 years of life carries the day against the ignorance, the fear, and the anger of men, he appears no longer to me as I saw him last, a white speck catching all the dim light left upon a sombre coast and the darkened sea, but greater and more pitiful in the loneliness of his soul, that remains even for her who loved him best a cruel and insoluble mystery. It is evident that he did not mistrust Brown. There was no reason to doubt the story, whose truth seemed warranted by the rough frankness, by a sort of virile sincerity in accepting the morality and consequences of his acts. But Jim did not know the almost inconceivable egotism of the man which made him, when resisted and foiled in his will, mad with the indignant and revengeful rage of a thwarted autocrat. But if Jim did not mistrust Brown, he was evidently anxious that some misunderstanding should not occur, ending perhaps in collision and bloodshed. It was for this reason that directly the Malay chiefs had gone he asked Jewel to get him something to eat, as he was going out of the fort to take command in the town. On her remonstrating against this on the score of his fatigue, he said that something might happen for which he would never forgive himself. "I am responsible for every life in the land," he said. He was moody at first. She served him with her own hands, taking the plates and dishes of the dinner service presented him by Stein from Tamb' Itam. He brightened up after a while, told her she would be again in command of the fort for another night. "There's no sleep for us, old girl," he said, "while our people are in danger." Later on he said jokingly that she was the best man of them all. "If you and Dain Waris had done what you wanted, not one of these poor devils would be alive to day." "Are they very bad?" she asked, leaning over his chair. "Men act badly sometimes, without being much worse than others," he said after some hesitation. Tamb' Itam followed his master to the landing stage outside the fort. The night was clear, but without a moon, and the middle of the river was dark, while the water underneath each bank reflected the light of many fires, as on a night of Ramadan, Tamb' Itam said. War boats drifted silently in the dark lane, or, anchored, floated motionless with a loud ripple. That night there was much paddling in a canoe and walking at his master's heels for Tamb' Itam. Up and down the street they tramped, where the fires were burning, inland on the outskirts of the town where small parties of men kept guard in the fields. Tuan Jim gave his orders and was obeyed. Last of all they went to the Rajah's stockade, which a detachment of Jim's people manned that night. The old Rajah had fled early in the morning with most of his women to a small house he had near a jungle village on a tributary stream. Kassim, left behind, had attended the council with his air of diligent activity to explain away the diplomacy of the day before. He was considerably cold-shouldered, but he managed to preserve his smiling, quiet alertness, and professed himself highly delighted when Jim told him sternly that he proposed to occupy the stockade that night with his own men. After the council broke up he was heard outside accosting this and that deputing chief, and speaking in a loud gratified tone of the Rajah's property being protected in the Rajah's absence. About 10 or so Jim's men marched in. The stockade commanded the mouth of the creek, and Jim meant to remain there till Brown had passed below. A small fire was lit on the flat grassy point outside the wall of stakes, and Tamb' Itam placed a little folding stool for his master. Jim told him to try and sleep. Tamb' Itam got a mat and lay down a little way off, but he could not sleep, though he knew he had to go on an important journey before the night was out. His master walked to and fro before the fire with bowed head, and with his hands behind his back. His face was sad. Whenever his master approached him, Tamb' Itam pretended to sleep, not wishing his master to know he had been watched. At last his master stood still, looking down on him as he lay, and said softly, "It is time." Tamb' Itam arose directly and made his preparations. His mission was to go down the river, preceding Brown's boat by an hour or more, to tell Dain Waris, finally and formally, that the whites were to be allowed to pass out unmolested. Jim would not trust anybody else with that service. Before starting, Tamb' Itam, more as a matter of form, since his position about Jim made him perfectly known, asked for a token. "Because, Tuan," he said, "the message is important, and these are thy very words I carry." His master first put his hand into one pocket and then into another, and finally took off his forefinger Stein's silver ring, which he habitually wore, and gave it to Tamb' Itam. When Tamb' Itam left on his mission, Brown's camp on the knoll was dark but for a single small glow shining through the branches of one of the trees the white men had cut down. Early in the evening Brown had received from Jim a folded piece of paper on which was written, "You get a clear road. Start as soon as your boat floats on the morning tide. Let your men be careful. The bushes on both sides of the creek and the stockade at the mouth are full of well-armed men. You would have no chance, but I don't believe you want bloodshed." Brown read it, tore the paper into small pieces, and turning to Cornelius, who had brought it, said jeeringly, "Good bye, my excellent friend." Cornelius had been in the fort, and had been sneaking around Jim's house during the afternoon. Jim chose him to carry the note because he could speak English, was known to Brown, and was not likely to be shot by some nervous mistake of one of the men as a Malay approaching in the dusk perhaps might have been. Cornelius didn't go away after delivering the paper. Brown was sitting up over a tiny fire. All the others were lying down. "I could tell you something you would like to know," Cornelius mumbled crossly. Brown paid no attention. "You did not kill him," went on the other, "and what did you get for it? You might have had money from the Rajah, besides the loot of all the Bugis' houses, and now you get nothing." "You'd better clear out from here," growled Brown, without even looking at him. But Cornelius let himself drop by his side and began to whisper very fast, touching his elbow from time to time. What he had to say made Brown sit up at first with a curse. He had simply informed him of Dain Waris's armed party down the river. At first Brown saw himself completely sold and betrayed, but a moment's reflection convinced him that there could be no treachery intended. He said nothing, and after a while Cornelius remarked, in a tone of complete indifference, that there was another way out of the river which he knew very well. "A good thing to know, too," said Brown, pricking up his ears, and Cornelius began to talk of what went on in town, and repeated all that had been said in council, gossiping in an even undertone at Brown's ear as you talk amongst sleeping men you do not wish to wake. "He thinks he has made me harmless, does he?" mumbled Brown very low.
Yes, he is a fool, a little child. He came here and robbed me, droned on Cornelius, and he made all the people believe him. But if something happened that they did not believe him any more, where would he be? And the Bugis Dain who is waiting for you down the river there, captain, is the very man who chased you up here when you first came."
Brown observed nonchalantly that it would be just as well to avoid him, and with the same detached, musing air Cornelius declared himself acquainted with a backwater broad enough to take Brown's boat past Waris's camp.
"You will have to be quiet," he said as an afterthought, "for in one place we pass close behind his camp. Very close. They are camped ashore, with their boats hauled up." "Oh, we know how to be quiet as mice. Never fear," said Brown.
Cornelius stipulated that in case he were to pilot Brown out, his canoe should be towed.
"I'll have to get back quick," he explained.
It was 2 hours before the dawn when word was passed to the stockade from outlying watchers that the white robbers were coming down to their boat. In a very short time every armed man, from one end of Patusan to the other, was on the alert, yet the banks of the river remained so silent that but for the fires burning with sudden blurred flares the town might have been asleep as if in peace time. A heavy mist lay very low on the water, making a sort of elusive grey light that showed nothing. When Brown's longboat glided out of the creek into the river, Jim was standing on the low point of land before the Rajah's stockade, on the very spot where for the first time he put his foot on Patusan shore. A shadow loomed up, moving in the greyness, solitary, very bulky, and yet constantly eluding the eye. A murmur of low talking came out of it. Brown at the tiller heard Jim speak calmly. "A clear road. You had better trust to the current while the fog lasts, but this will lift presently."
"Yes, presently we shall see clear," replied Brown.
The 30 or 40 men standing with muskets at ready outside the stockade held their breath. The Bugis owner of the prau, whom I saw on Stein's veranda and who was amongst them, told me that the boat, shaving the low point close, seemed for a moment to grow big and hang over it like a mountain. "If you think it worth your while to wait a day outside," called out Jim, "I'll try to send you down something, a bullock, some yams, what I can." The shadow went on moving.
"Yes, do,"
said a voice, blank and muffled out of the fog. Not one of the many attentive listeners understood what the words meant, and then Brown and his men in their boat floated away, fading spectrally, without the slightest sound. Thus Brown, invisible in the mist, goes out of Patusan elbow to elbow with Cornelius in the stern sheets of the long boat.
"Perhaps you shall get a small bullock," said Cornelius. "Oh yes, bullock, yam. You'll get it if he said so. He always speaks the truth. He stole everything I had. I suppose you like a small bullock better than the loot of many houses." "I would advise you to hold your tongue, or somebody here may fling you overboard in this damned fog," said Brown.
The boat seemed to be standing still. Nothing could be seen, not even the river alongside. Only the water dust flew and trickled, condensed, down their beards and faces. It was weird, Brown told me. Every individual man of them felt as though he were adrift alone in a boat, haunted by an almost imperceptible suspicion of sighing, muttering ghosts.
"Throw me out, would you? But I would know where I was," mumbled Cornelius surlily. "I've lived many years here." "Not long enough to see through a fog like this," Brown said, lolling back with his arms swinging to and fro on the useless tiller. "Yes, long enough for that," snarled Cornelius. "That's very useful," commented Brown. "Am I to believe you could find that back way you spoke of blindfold like this?" Cornelius grunted. "Are you too tired to row?" he asked after a silence. "No, by God!" shouted Brown suddenly. "Out with your oars there!" There was a great knocking in the fog, which after a while settled into a regular grind of invisible sweeps against invisible thole pins.
Otherwise nothing was changed. But for the slight splash of a dipped blade, it was like rowing a balloon car in a cloud, said Brown. Thereafter Cornelius did not open his lips except to ask querulously for somebody to bail out his canoe, which was towing behind the long boat. Gradually the fog whitened and became luminous ahead. To the left Brown saw a darkness as though he had been looking at the back of the departing night. All at once a big bough covered with leaves appeared above his head, and the ends of twigs, dripping and still, curved slenderly close alongside. Cornelius, without a word, took the tiller from his hand. CHAPTER 44 I don't think they spoke together again. The boat entered a narrow by channel where it was pushed by the oar blades set into crumbling banks, and there was a gloom as if enormous black wings had been outspread above the mist that filled its depths to the summits of the trees. The branches overhead showered big drops through a gloomy fog. At a mutter from Cornelius, Brown ordered his men to load.
I'll give you a chance to get even with them before we're done, you dismal cripples, you, he said to his gang. Mind you don't throw it away, you hounds.
Low growls answered that speech. Cornelius showed much fussy concern for the safety of his canoe. Meanwhile Tamb' Itam had reached the end of his journey. The fog had delayed him a little, but he had paddled steadily, keeping in touch with the south bank. By and by daylight came, like a glow in a ground glass globe. The shores made on each side of the river a dark smudge, in which one could detect hints of columnar forms and shadows of twisted branches high up. The mist was still thick on the water, but a good watch was being kept, for as Tamb' Itam approached the camp the figures of two men emerged out of the white vapour, and voices spoke to him boisterously. He answered, and presently a canoe lay alongside, and he exchanged news with the paddlers. All was well; the trouble was over. Then the men in the canoe let go their grip on the side of his dug out, and incontinently fell out of sight. He pursued his way till he heard voices coming to him quietly over the water, and saw under the now lifting swirling mists the glow of many little fires burning on a sandy stretch, backed up by lofty thin timber and bushes. There again a look out was kept, for he was challenged. He shouted his name as the two last sweeps of his paddle ran his canoe up on the strand. It was a big camp. Men crouched in many little knots under a subdued murmur of early morning talk. Many thin threads of smoke curled slowly on the white mist. Little shelters, elevated above the ground, had been built for the chiefs. Muskets were stacked in small pyramids, and long spears were stuck singly into the sand near the fires. Tamb' Itam, assuming an air of importance, demanded to be led to Dain Waris. He found the friend of his white lord lying on a raised couch made of bamboo, and sheltered by a sort of shed of sticks covered with mats. Dain Waris was awake, and a bright fire was burning before his sleeping place, which resembled a rude shrine. The only son of Nakoda Doramin answered his greeting kindly. Tamb' Itam began by handing him the ring which vouched for the truth of the messenger's words. Dain Waris, reclining on his elbow, bade him speak and tell all the news. Beginning with the consecrated formula, "The news is good," Tamb' Itam delivered Jim's own words. The white men, deputing with the consent of all the chiefs, were to be allowed to pass down the river. In answer to a question or two, Tamb' Itam reported the proceedings of the last council. Dain Waris listened attentively to the end, toying with the ring, which ultimately he slipped on the forefinger of his right hand. After hearing all he had to say, he dismissed Tamb' Itam to have food and rest. Orders for the return in the afternoon were given immediately. Afterwards Dain Waris lay down again, open-eyed, while his personal attendants were preparing his food at the fire, by which Tamb' Itam also sat talking to the men who lounged up to hear the latest intelligence from the town. The sun was eating up the mist. A good watch was kept upon the reach of the main stream, where the boat of the whites was expected to appear every moment. It was then that Brown took his revenge upon the world which, after 20 years of contemptuous and reckless bullying, refused him the tribute of a common robber's success. It was an act of cold-blooded ferocity, and it consoled him on his deathbed like a memory of an indomitable defiance. Stealthily he landed his men on the other side of the island, opposite to the Bugis camp, and led them across. After a short but silent scuffle, Cornelius, who had tried to slink away at the moment of landing, resigned himself to show the way where the undergrowth was most sparse. Brown held both his skinny hands together behind his back in the grip of one vast fist, and now and then impelled him forward with a fierce push. Cornelius remained as mute as a fish, abject, but faithful to his purpose, whose accomplishment loomed before him dimly. At the edge of the patch of forest Brown's men spread themselves out in cover and waited. The camp was plain from end to end before their eyes, and no one looked their way. Nobody even dreamed that the white men could have any knowledge of the narrow channel at the back of the island. When he judged the moment come, Brown yelled, "Let them have it!" and 14 shots rang out like one. Tamb' Itam told me the surprise was so great that, except for those who fell dead or wounded, not a soul of them moved for quite an appreciable time after the first discharge. Then a man screamed, and after that scream a great yell of amazement and fear went up from all throats. A blind panic drove these men in a surging, swaying mob to and fro along the shore like a herd of cattle afraid of the water. Some few jumped into the river then, but most of them did so only after the last discharge. 3 times Brown's men fired into the ruck, Brown, the only one in view, cursing and yelling, "Aim low! Aim low!" Tamb' Itam says that as for him, he understood at the first volley what had happened. Though untouched, he fell down and lay as if dead, but with his eyes open. At the sound of the first shots Dain Waris, reclining on the couch, jumped up and ran out upon the open shore, just in time to receive a bullet in his forehead at the second discharge. Tamb' Itam saw him fling his arms wide open before he fell. Then, he says, a great fear came upon him, not before. The white men retired as they had come, unseen. Thus Brown balanced his account with the evil fortune. Notice that even in this awful outbreak there is a superiority as of a man who carries right, the abstract thing, within the envelope of his common desires. It was not a vulgar and treacherous massacre. It was a lesson, a retribution, a demonstration of some obscure and awful attribute of our nature which, I am afraid, is not so very far under the surface as we like to think. Afterwards the whites depart, unseen by Tamb' Itam, and seem to vanish from before men's eyes altogether, and the schooner too vanishes after the manner of stolen goods. But a story is told of a white longboat picked up a month later in the Indian Ocean by a cargo steamer. 2 parched, yellow, glassy-eyed, whispering skeletons in her recognized the authority of a third, who declared that his name was Brown. His schooner, he reported, bound south with a cargo of Java sugar, had sprung a bad leak and sank under his feet. He and his companions were the survivors of a crew of 6. The 2 died on board the steamer which rescued them. Brown lived to be seen by me, and I can testify that he had played his part to the last. It seems, however, that in going away they had neglected to cast off Cornelius's canoe. Cornelius himself Brown had let go at the beginning of the shooting, with a kick for a parting benediction. Tamb' Itam, after arising from amongst the dead, saw the Nazarene running up and down the shore amongst the corpses and expiring fires. He uttered little cries. Suddenly he rushed to the water and made frantic efforts to get one of the Bugis boats into the water. Afterwards, till he had seen me, related Tamb' Itam, he stood looking at the heavy canoe and scratching his head. What became of him? I asked. Tamb' Itam, staring hard at me, made an expressive gesture with his right arm. "Twice I struck, Tuan,"
he said. When he beheld me approaching, he cast himself violently on the ground, and made a great outcry, kicking. He screeched like a frightened hen till he felt the point. Then he was still, and lay staring at me while the life went out of his eyes.
This done, Tamb' Itam did not tarry. He understood the importance of being first with the awful news at the fort. There were, of course, many survivors of Dain Waris's party, but in the extremity of panic some had swum across the river, others had bolted into the bush. The fact is that they did not know really who struck that blow, whether more white robbers were not coming, whether they had not already got hold of the whole land. They imagined themselves to be the victims of a vast treachery, and utterly doomed to destruction. It is said that some small parties did not come in till 3 days afterwards. However, a few tried to make their way back to Patusan at once, and one of the canoes that were patrolling the river that morning was in sight of the camp at the very moment of the attack. It is true that at first the men in her leaped overboard and swam to the opposite bank, but afterwards they returned to their boat and started fearfully upstream. Of these Tamb' Itam had an hour's advance. End of chapters 43 and 44. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stewart Wills. Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 45. When Tamb' Itam, paddling madly, came into the town reach, the women thronging the platforms before the house were looking out for the return of Dain Waris's little fleet of boats. The town had a festive air. Here and there men, still with spears or guns in their hands, could be seen moving or standing on the shore in groups. Chinamen's shops had been opened early, but the market-place was empty, and a sentry still posted at the corner of the fort made out Tamb' Itam and shouted to those within. The gate was wide open. Tamb' Itam jumped ashore and ran in headlong. The first person he met was the girl coming down from the house. Tamb' Itam, disordered, panting, with trembling lips and wild eyes, stood for a time before her as if a sudden spell had been laid on him. Then he broke out very quickly, "They have killed Dain Waris and many more." She clapped her hands, and her first words were, "Shut the gates." Most of the fortmen had gone back to their houses, but Tamb' Itam hurried on the few who remained for their turn of duty within. The girl stood in the middle of the courtyard while others ran about. "Doramin!" she cried despairingly, as Tamb' Itam passed her. Next time he went by he answered her thought rapidly. "Yes, but we have all the powder in Patusan." She caught him by the arm, and, pointing at the house, "Call him out," she whispered, trembling. Tamb' Itam ran up the steps. His master was sleeping. "It is I, Tamb' Itam," he cried at the door, "with tidings that cannot wait." He saw Jim turn over on the pillow and open his eyes, and he burst out at once, "This, Tuan, is a day of evil, an accursed day." His master raised himself on his elbow to listen, just as Dain Waris had done. Then Tamb' Itam began his tale, trying to relate the story in order, calling Dain Waris Panglima, and saying, "The Panglima then called out to the chief of his own boatmen, 'Give Tamb' Itam something to eat.'" When his master put his feet to the ground and looked at him with such a discomposed face that the words remained in his throat. "Speak out," said Jim. "Is he dead?" "May you live long," cried Tamb' Itam. "It was a most cruel treachery. He ran out at the first shots and fell." His master walked to the window and with his fist struck at the shutter. The room was made light, and then in a steady voice, but speaking fast, he began to give him orders to assemble a fleet of boats for immediate pursuit, go to this man, to the other, send messengers, and as he talked he sat down on the bed, stooping to lace his boots hurriedly, and suddenly looked up. "Why do you stand there?" he asked, very red-faced.
"Waste no time."
Tamb' Itam did not move.
"Forgive me, Tuan, but
He began to stammer. "What?" cried his master aloud, looking terrible, leaning forward with his hands gripping the edge of the bed.
"It is not safe for thy servant to go out amongst the people,"
said Tamb' Itam, after hesitating for a moment. Then Jim understood. He had retreated from one world for a small matter of an impulsive jump, and now the other, the work of his own hands, had fallen in ruins upon his head. It was not safe for his servant to go out amongst his own people. I believe that in that very moment he had decided to defy the disaster in the only way it occurred to him such a disaster could be defied. But all I know is that without a word he came out of his room and sat before the long table, at the head of which he was accustomed to regulate the affairs of his world, proclaiming daily the truth that surely lived in his heart. The dark powers should not rob him twice of his peace. He sat like a stone figure. Tamb' Itam, deferential, hinted at preparations for defence. The girl he loved came in and spoke to him, but he made a sign with his hands, and she was awed by the dumb appeal for silence in it. She went out on the verandah and sat on the threshold, as if to guard him with her body from the dangers outside. What thoughts passed through his head? What memories? Who can tell? Everything was gone, and he who had been once unfaithful to his trust had lost again all men's confidence. It was then, I believe, he tried to write to somebody and gave it up. Loneliness was closing on him. People had trusted him with their lives only for that, and yet they could never, as he had said, never be made to understand him. Those without did not hear him make a sound. Later, towards the evening, he came to the door and called for Tamb' Itam.
"Well?" he asked. "There is much weeping, much anger too," said Tamb' Itam.
Jim looked up at him.
"You know," he murmured.
"Yes, Tuan," said Tamb' Itam.
"Thy servant does know, and the gates are closed. We shall have to fight."
"Fight? What for?" he asked.
"For our lives." "I have no life," he said.
Tamb' Itam heard a cry from the girl at the door.
"Who knows?" said Tamb' Itam. "By audacity and cunning we may even escape. There is much fear in men's hearts too."
He went out, thinking vaguely of boats and of open sea, leaving Jim and the girl together. I haven't the heart to set down here such glimpses as she had given me of the hour or more she passed in there wrestling with him for the possession of her happiness. Whether he had any hope, what he expected, what he imagined, it is impossible to say. He was inflexible, and with the growing loneliness of his obstinacy his spirit seemed to rise above the ruins of his existence. She cried "Fight!" into his ear. She could not understand. There was nothing to fight for. He was going to prove his power in another way and conquer the fatal destiny itself. He came out into the courtyard, and behind him, with streaming hair, wild of face, breathless, she staggered out and leaned on the side of the doorway.
"Open the gates," he ordered.
Afterward, turning to those of his men who were inside, he gave them leave to depart to their homes.
"For how long, Tuan?"
asked one of them timidly.
"For all life," he said in a sombre tone.
A hush had fallen upon the town after the outburst of wailing and lamentation that had swept over the river, like a gust of wind from an open abode of sorrow. But rumours fell in whispers, filling the hearts with consternation and horrible doubts. The robbers were coming back, bringing many others with them in a great ship, and there would be no refuge in the land for any one. A sense of utter insecurity, as during an earthquake, pervaded the minds of men, who whispered their suspicions, looking at each other as if in the presence of some awful portent. The sun was sinking towards the forest when Dain Waris's body was brought into Doramin's campong. 4 men carried it in. covered decently with a white sheet, which the old mother had sent out down to the gate to meet her son on his return. They laid him at Doramin's feet, and the old man sat still for a long time, one hand on each knee, looking down. The fronds of palms swayed gently, and the foliage of fruit trees stirred above his head. Every single man of his people was there, fully armed, when the old nakhoda at last raised his eyes. He moved them slowly over the crowd as if seeking for a missing face. Again his chin sank on his breast. The whispers of many men mingled with the slight rustling of the leaves. The Malay who had brought Tamb' Itam and the girl to Samarang was there too. Not so angry as many, he said to me, but struck with a great awe and wonder at the suddenness of men's fate, which hangs over their heads like a cloud charged with thunder. He told me that when Dain Waris's body was uncovered at a sign of Doramin's, he whom they often called the White Lord's friend was disclosed lying unchanged with his eyelids a little open as if about to wake. Doramin leaned forward a little more, like one looking for something fallen on the ground. His eyes searched the body from its feet to its head, for the wound maybe. It was in the forehead and small, and there was no word spoken while one of the bystanders, stooping, took off the silver ring from the cold stiff hand. In silence he held it up before Doramin. A murmur of dismay and horror ran through the crowd at the sight of that familiar token. The old nakhoda stared at it, and suddenly let out one great fierce cry, deep from the chest, a roar of pain and fury, as mighty as the bellow of a wounded bull, bringing great fear into men's hearts, by the magnitude of his anger and his sorrow that could be plainly discerned without words. There was a great stillness afterwards for a space while the body was being borne aside by 4 men. They laid it down under a tree, and on the instant, with one long shriek, all the women of the household began to wail together. They mourned with shrill cries. The sun was setting, and in the intervals of screamed lamentations the high sing-song voices of 2 old men intoning the Koran chanted alone. About this time Jim, leaning on a gun carriage, looked at the river, and turned his back on the house, and the girl in the doorway, panting as if she had run herself to a standstill, was looking at him across the yard. Tamb' Itam stood not far from his master, waiting patiently for what might happen. All at once Jim, who seemed to be lost in quiet thought, turned to him and said, "Time to finish this." "Tuan," said Tamb' Itam, advancing with alacrity. He did not know what his master meant, but as soon as Jim made a movement the girl started too, and walked down into the open space. It seemed that no one else of the people of the house was in sight. She tottered slightly, and about half-way down called out to Jim, who had apparently resumed his peaceful contemplation of the river. He turned round, setting his back against the gun. "Will you fight?" she cried. "There is nothing to fight for," he said. "Nothing is lost." Saying this, he made a step towards her. "Will you fly?" she cried again. "There is no escape," he said, stopping short, and she stood still also, silent, devouring him with her eyes. "And you shall go," she said slowly. He bent his head. "Ah!" she exclaimed, peering at him as it were, "you are mad or false. Do you remember the night I prayed you to leave me and you said that you could not? That it was impossible? Impossible? Do you remember you said you would never leave me? Why? I asked you for no promise. You promised, unasked. Remember?" "Enough, poor girl," he said. "I should not be worth having." Tamb' Itam said that while they were talking she would laugh loud and senselessly, like one under the visitation of God. His master put his hands to his head. He was fully dressed as for every day, but without a hat. She stopped laughing suddenly. "For the last time," she cried menacingly, "will you defend yourself?" "Nothing can touch me," he said in a last flicker of superb egoism. Tamb' Itam saw her lean forward where she stood, open her arms, and run at him swiftly. She flung herself upon his breast and clasped him round the neck. "Ah, but I shall hold thee thus," she cried. "Thou art mine." She sobbed on his shoulder. The sky over Patusan was blood red, immense, streaming like an open vein. An enormous sun nestled crimson amongst the tree tops, and the forest below had a black and forbidding face. Tamb' Itam tells me that on that evening the aspect of the heavens was angry and frightful. I may well believe it, for I know that on that very day a cyclone passed within 60 miles of the coast, though there was hardly more than a languid stir of air in the place. Suddenly Tamb' Itam saw Jim catch her arms, trying to unclasp her hands. She hung on them with her head fallen back. Her hair touched the ground. "Come here," his master called, and Tamb' Itam helped ease her down. It was difficult to separate her fingers. Jim, bending over her, looked earnestly upon her face, and all at once ran to the landing stage. Tamb' Itam followed him, but turning his head he saw that she had struggled up to her feet. She ran after them a few steps, then fell down heavily on her knees. "Tuan! Tuan!" called Tamb' Itam. "Look back!" But Jim was already in a canoe. Standing up, paddle in hand, he did not look back. Tamb' Itam had just time to scramble in after him when the canoe floated clear. The girl was then on her knees with clasped hands at the water gate. She remained thus for a time in a supplicating attitude before she sprang up. "You are false!" she screamed after Jim. "Forgive me!" he cried. "Never, never!" she called back. Tamb' Itam took the paddle from Jim's hands, it being unseemly that he should sit while his lord paddled. When they reached the other shore his master forbade him to come any farther, but Tamb' Itam did follow him at a distance, walking up the slope to Doramin's campong. It was beginning to grow dark. Torches twinkled here and there. Those they met seemed awestruck, and stood aside hastily to let Jim pass. The wailing of women came from above. The courtyard was full of armed Bugis with their followers, and of Patusan people. I do not know what this gathering really meant. Were these preparations for war, or for vengeance, or to repulse a threatened invasion? Many days elapsed before people had ceased to look out quaking for the return of the white men with long beards and in rags, whose exact relation to their own white man they could never understand. Even for those simple minds poor Jim remains under a cloud. Doramin alone, immense and desolate, sat in his arm chair with the pair of flintlock pistols on his knees, faced by an armed throng. When Jim appeared, at somebody's exclamation, all heads turned round together, and then the mass opened right and left, and he walked up a lane of averted glances. Whispers followed him, murmurs. "He has worked all the evil. He hath a charm." He heard them, perhaps. When he came up to the light of torches the wailing of the women ceased suddenly. Doramin did not lift his head, and Jim stood silent before him for a time. Then he looked to the left and moved in that direction with measured steps. Dain Waris's mother crouched at the head of the body, and the grey dishevelled hair concealed her face. Jim came up slowly, looked at his dead friend, lifting the sheet, then dropped it without a word. Slowly he walked back. "He came! He came!" was running from lip to lip, making a murmur to which he moved. "He hath taken it upon his own head," a voice said aloud. He heard this, and turned to the crowd. "Yes, upon my head." A few people recoiled. Jim waited a while before Doramin, and then said gently, "I am come in sorrow." He waited again. "I am come, ready and unarmed," he repeated. The unwieldy old man, lowering his big forehead like an ox under a yoke, made an effort to rise, clutching at the flintlock pistols on his knees. From his throat came gurgling, choking, inhuman sounds, and his two attendants helped him from behind. People remarked that the ring which he had dropped on his lap fell and rolled against the foot of the white man, and that poor Jim glanced down at the talisman that had opened for him the door of fame, love, and success, within the wall of forests fringed with white foam, within the coast that under the western sun looks like the very stronghold of the night. Doramin, struggling to keep his feet, made with his two supporters a swaying, tottering group. His little eyes stared with an expression of mad pain, of rage, with a ferocious glitter, which the bystanders noticed. And then, while Jim stood stiffened and with bared head in the light of torches, looking him straight in the face, he clung heavily with his left arm round the neck of a bowed youth, and lifting deliberately his right, shot his son's friend through the chest. The crowd, which had fallen apart behind Jim as soon as Doramin had raised his hand, rushed tumultuously forward after the shot. They say that the white man sent right and left at all those faces a proud and unflinching glance. Then, with his hand over his lips, he fell forward, dead. And that's the end. He passes away under a cloud, inscrutable at heart, forgotten, unforgiven, and excessively romantic. Not in the wildest days of his boyish visions could he have seen the alluring shape of such an extraordinary success. For it may very well be that in the short moment of his last proud and unflinching glance he had beheld the face of that opportunity which, like an Eastern bride, had come veiled to his side. But we can see him, an obscure conqueror of fame, tearing himself out of the arms of a jealous love at the sign, at the call of his exalted egoism. He goes away from a living woman to celebrate his pitiless wedding with a shadowy ideal of conduct. Is he satisfied? Quite now, I wonder? We ought to know. He is one of us. And have I not stood up once like an evoked ghost to answer for his eternal constancy? Was I so very wrong after all? Now he is no more, there are days when the reality of his existence comes to me with an immense, with an overwhelming force. And yet, upon my honour, there are moments too when he passes from my eyes like a disembodied spirit astray amongst the passions of this earth, ready to surrender himself faithfully to the claim of his own world of shades. Who knows? He is gone, inscrutable at heart, and the poor girl is leading a sort of soundless, inert life in Stein's house. Stein has aged greatly of late. He feels it himself, and says often that he is preparing to leave all this, preparing to leave, while he waves his hand sadly at his butterflies. September 1899 to July 1900. The end. End of chapter 45 and end of the novel.